The drifter found a widow alone in the silo. Then, her late husband's partner showed up to claim it. Adelaide Finch had $12, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools she'd carried since her last steady job on a grain elevator maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any silo she passed for signs of continued use. A habit that had led her, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of shelter that kept her fed for a few weeks at a stretch. She was 21 years old, laid off 9 months earlier when the regional co-op that employed her merged its maintenance operations into a single traveling crew serving 4 counties instead of 1, eliminating every dedicated local position along the way. She had been moving through farm country ever since, taking whatever short-term work she could find. The merger notice had cited operational efficiency as its reasoning, the same phrase Adelaide had come to recognize across 9 months of towns exactly like this one, as the corporate language for deciding that a maintenance worker's specific familiarity with a single facility mattered less than whatever a traveling crew could theoretically manage across 4 counties instead. She had grown up around silos and elevators her whole life, her father having worked grain storage maintenance for 3 decades before her, and she had learned, riding along on his service calls from an early age, to read a silo's condition the way another person might read a familiar face. 9 months of moving had taught her the particular economy of a life spent between towns, day labor paid in cash, a week here and a month there, and always, always the habit of scouting shelter before she scouted anything else. She had grown leaner over those 9 months in the way a body does when it's fed just enough to keep working rather than enough to feel fully steady. And she had stopped, somewhere around month 6, expecting any given week to end better than it had started. She found the old grain silo at the edge of a modest farm on a cool evening in early autumn, a tall concrete structure standing beside a small operations building, both showing the particular neglect of a business that had recently lost whoever kept it running. Weeds had grown up thick around the loading dock, and the operations building's own paint had begun peeling in a way that suggested months rather than years of neglect, the particular signature of a place that had simply lost its steady hand rather than been abandoned outright. She climbed the silo's exterior ladder out of habit more than expectation, checking its condition the way she checked every piece of infrastructure she passed, and found, at the small platform near its base access door, a woman sitting alone in the gathering dusk, startled by Adelaide's sudden appearance at the ladder's top. The woman had clearly been sitting there a while, her posture the particular stillness of someone who had come up to a quiet, elevated place, simply to be alone with thoughts too heavy to carry inside 4 walls. "I didn't expect anyone else out here tonight," the woman said, recovering herself quickly enough that Adelaide understood she was dealing with someone who had learned, recently and painfully, to manage her own fear rather than simply indulge it. "This is my late husband's property. I don't believe we've met." "I'm sorry to startle you," Adelaide said. "I saw the silo from the road and wanted to check its condition. I didn't realize anyone was still living out here." "I am, for now," the woman said. "Name's Cordelia Marsh. My husband Everett ran this grain operation for 20 years, jointly with a partner, before a heart attack took him 3 months ago. I've been staying in the old office building since, trying to decide what comes next." She studied Adelaide a long moment. "You're not one of Grady's people, are you? He's taken to sending men out to assess the property's condition, as though I might have let it fall apart in 3 months of grief." "I don't know who Grady is," Adelaide said. "I don't know anything about any of this, if I'm honest. I just followed the road and climbed a ladder." "Then you're about to learn a great deal more than you bargained for," Cordelia said, and gestured toward the operations building, where a small light burned in one window. "Come down off that ladder before you catch a chill, and I'll explain over what coffee I have left." Over the following hour, Cordelia told Adelaide in the plain, exhausted voice of someone who had explained the situation to herself too many times already. Exactly why a widow was living alone at the edge of a grain operation she no longer fully understood the legal status of. Everett Marsh had run the grain business jointly with a man named Grady Loomis for 20 years, the two of them having built the operation together from a much smaller start, splitting ownership evenly under a partnership agreement drafted decades earlier by an attorney neither of them had thought much about since. Everett's sudden death that past summer had left Cordelia believing at first that she would simply inherit her husband's half of the business outright, until Grady Loomis arrived within the week to inform her that the original partnership agreement contained a buy-sell clause automatically transferring a deceased partner's interest to the surviving partner at a valuation fixed by a formula written into the agreement nearly 20 years earlier. They met at a grain co-op meeting, of all places, Cordelia said, some evenings later, telling Adelaide more of the history behind the two men's friendship than she'd shared during that first hurried explanation. Both of them barely into their 20s, both convinced the local elevator companies were shortchanging small farmers on storage rates. They pooled what little money they each had and leased this exact silo from a retiring owner who wanted to see it kept running rather than torn down. 20 years, and I watched it grow from something they could barely afford the lease payments on into an operation that actually matters to half the farmers in this county. What changed between them, do you think? Adelaide asked. I don't know that anything changed exactly, Cordelia said. I think Grady was always more focused on what the business could become than what it currently was, and Everett was always more content with what they'd already built together. That difference never seemed to matter while Everett was alive to balance it. I think, without him here to do that balancing, whatever ambition Grady always carried simply stopped having anything to answer to. Grady says, the formula values my half of this operation at barely a fraction of what it's actually worth today, Cordelia said. Grain prices, land values, the equipment we've added over the years, none of it factored into a valuation formula written when this business was worth 1/10 of what it is now. He's offered me that fixed sum, take it or leave it, and informed me the partnership agreement gives him no obligation to negotiate further. That sounds like a formula written to benefit whoever outlives the other partner, Adelaide said, regardless of what either man actually intended at the time. I've wondered the same thing myself these past 3 months, Cordelia said. Everett always spoke of Grady as a friend as much as a business partner. I don't know when that changed, or if it changed at all, or whether Grady's simply seeing an opportunity now that grief has made me too tired to fight him properly. Grief has a way of revealing exactly who was always willing to take advantage, given the right circumstances, Adelaide said. I don't think that makes the discovery any less painful, even when it isn't entirely surprising. Have you had an attorney review the actual agreement? Adelaide asked. I don't have the money for a proper review, Cordelia said. Everett always handled the business side of things. I kept the books current and helped where I could, but the actual legal paperwork was his domain, and I'm ashamed to admit I never once asked to see the original agreement myself while he was alive. I've only got Grady's word for what it actually says. Adelaide spent the following days doing the only thing she knew how to do with what little she had. She looked at what the silo and its operation actually needed, understanding that making herself useful was the only currency she had to offer a woman navigating grief and a legal dispute she didn't fully understand at the same time. The silo's aeration system, meant to keep stored grain from spoiling through proper airflow, had failed weeks earlier, and Adelaide spent 3 days diagnosing and repairing a blown fan motor she found, replaceable with parts she scavenged from a similar unit in the operations building's storage shed. Work that likely saved a portion of the season's remaining stored grain from spoilage that would have cost Cordelia considerably more than she could currently afford to lose. She also cleared a clogged intake screen that had been restricting airflow even before the motor failed entirely. and tested the whole system through a full cycle before trusting it to run unattended overnight. She spent the following week checking the silo's structural condition more broadly, climbing its full height to inspect the roof vents and the condition of the concrete itself, finding, to her considerable relief, that Everett Marsh had clearly maintained the structure properly through the years he'd run it. The neglect Cordelia worried about amounting to little more than the natural consequence of 3 months, without anyone qualified to notice small problems before they compounded into larger ones. She repaired a section of the loading auger's guard that had come loose, tightened the belt drive on the elevator leg, and replaced a cracked gauge on the moisture monitoring system. Small fixes that, taken together, restored the operation to something considerably closer to what it must have been under Everett's own careful attention. The moisture monitoring system in particular required careful calibration, its readings having drifted enough over months of neglect that Adelaide worried the stored grain's actual condition might not be accurately reflected on the gauges Cordelia had been relying on to make decisions about when to sell versus continue storing. She spent a full day recalibrating each sensor against a manual reference she found in the operations building's supply cabinet, cross-checking the results against physical samples she drew from 3 different levels within the silo itself, until she trusted the readings completely rather than merely hoping they were accurate. "I didn't even know that system needed calibrating," Cordelia admitted, watching Adelaide work. "I've been making decisions based on numbers I never once questioned, simply because they were the numbers the machine gave me. Most people never question them until something goes wrong," Adelaide said. "I don't think that's a failure on your part. I think it's simply not the kind of thing anybody teaches you to check, unless somebody specifically shows you how." Cordelia watched her work most afternoons, bringing coffee and sitting nearby with the particular grateful quiet of someone who hadn't realized how much she'd needed another person's steady presence until it arrived uninvited up her silo ladder. "Everett would have known exactly what was wrong with that fan within an hour," she told Adelaide one afternoon. "I've felt these past months like I'm managing a business in a language I only half understand, guessing at things he always simply knew." "You know more than you're giving yourself credit for," Adelaide said. "You've kept the books for 15 years. That's not nothing, whatever Grady's implying about your capability to manage this place." "Grady's always had a particular talent for making other people feel smaller than they are," Cordelia said. "Everett used to say it was simply how Grady negotiated, that underneath it he meant well enough. I'm not certain I believe that anymore, watching how quickly he arrived with paperwork rather than condolences." "How soon after the funeral did he bring up the buyout?" Adelaide asked. 4 days, Cordelia said. "I hadn't even finished writing thank you notes for the flowers before he was standing in my kitchen with a folder, explaining the formula as though it were simply an unfortunate technicality rather than something he might have chosen to set aside, at least for a decent interval, out of respect for a friendship that supposedly meant something to him." It was in the operations building's small filing room, while helping Cordelia sort through Everett's business papers in search of anything that might clarify the partnership's actual terms, that Adelaide found a sealed envelope tucked behind a drawer's false bottom, addressed simply to "Cordelia, if anything happens to me," in Everett's own handwriting. She almost missed it entirely, the false bottom so carefully fitted that she'd nearly given up on the drawer holding anything beyond the ordinary invoices and receipts filling its visible contents. And it was only the slight give beneath her fingers, a fraction of an inch that shouldn't have existed in a properly built drawer, that made her look closer. "Cordelia," she said, her voice careful, "I think you'll want to see this yourself." Cordelia's hands shook as she opened it, and Adelaide gave her privacy to read the first page alone, stepping out onto the small porch until Cordelia called her back in, her voice thick with an emotion considerably more complicated than simple grief. Inside was a letter, dated just over 2 years before Everett's death, along with a formal amendment to the original partnership agreement, properly signed and notarized, that Everett had apparently arranged privately without informing Grady Loomis of its full implications. The amendment updated the buy-sell valuation formula to reflect current market conditions rather than the fixed sum from the original decades-old agreement, and further specified that in the event of Everett's death, Cordelia would have the right to either accept a buyout at the updated valuation or retain her inherited half-interest in the business and continue as a full partner alongside Grady at her own choosing. Everett's letter, read aloud by Cordelia in a voice that broke more than once, explained his reasoning plainly. I've watched Grady's own ambitions grow alongside this business over the years, and I don't fully trust that he'd treat you fairly if something happened to me before we'd properly updated an agreement. Neither of us thought much about when we were young men just starting out. I had this amendment drafted and notarized quietly, without mentioning it to Grady, because I wanted you protected regardless of how he might react to the news. I'm sorry I never found the right moment to tell you about it myself. I hope you never need it. I've made certain it exists regardless. There was a shorter passage near the letter's end that Cordelia read a second time before setting it down. You've spent 15 years keeping the books for this operation without ever once asking for the recognition you deserved for it. I want you to know I noticed, every single year, even when I wasn't always the man to say so plainly. Whatever happens to me, I want you to trust that you understand this business considerably better than you give yourself credit for, and that Grady, whatever his faults, will have a harder time convincing you otherwise than he probably expects. I don't understand why he never told me, Cordelia said once she'd finished reading. We didn't keep secrets from each other, not in 22 years of marriage. I think he was protecting you from having to carry the knowledge of Grady's potential reaction before it was ever necessary, Adelaide said. Some people keep a difficult truth quiet not to deceive the person they love, but to spare them worry over something that might never actually happen. I wish he'd trusted me with the worry anyway, Cordelia said. I'd have rather known and worried together than found out this way alone 3 months after he's gone. I don't think either choice would have been entirely right, Adelaide said gently. I think he simply did what he could with the time and the fear he had, and left you the one thing that actually mattered in the end. Proof, properly documented, that you were never as unprotected as Grady's been counting on you believing. Cordelia folded the letter carefully back into its envelope, holding it against her chest for a long moment before setting it aside. 22 years, and he still finds ways to take care of me, she said quietly. I don't know how to properly grieve a man who apparently isn't quite finished looking after me yet. Cordelia retained an attorney the following week, a careful woman named Louisa Pratt, who confirmed within days that the amendment was properly executed and legally binding, considerably strengthening Cordelia's position beyond anything Grady's original buyout offer had accounted for. Louisa's office, a modest storefront practice in the nearest town, specialized in exactly the kind of rural business and estate disputes that larger firms rarely bothered taking on, and she reviewed the amendment with the particular thoroughness of someone who had seen enough surviving partners attempt to take advantage of a grieving widow's unfamiliarity with legal process to recognize the pattern immediately. This is properly executed in every respect I can find fault with, Louisa told Cordelia and Adelaide both during their first meeting. Notarized, witnessed, dated clearly before your husband's death. Mr. Loomis's attorney will likely look for some technical defect to challenge, but I don't expect them to find one. Your husband was careful, Mrs. Marsh. This document reads like a man who understood exactly what he was protecting against. What happens if Grady challenges it anyway? Cordelia asked. Then we defend it, and I expect we'd win, Louisa said. But I suspect, once his own attorney reviews this properly, Mr. Loomis will find a protracted legal fight considerably less appealing than simply accepting the amendment's validity and negotiating a fair partnership arrangement instead. Most people in his position When the alternative to accepting reality is an expensive public legal battle they're unlikely to win, choose the quieter path eventually. Grady Loomis arrived at the property the following week, having been informed by Cordelia's newly retained attorney that a valid amendment to the partnership agreement had surfaced, considerably complicating the buyout he'd already begun treating as settled. "I don't know what document you think you found," Grady said, standing at the operations building's door with considerably less confidence than his earlier visits had carried. "But Everett and I built this business together on the original agreement's terms. I don't recall him ever mentioning any amendment to it. It's properly notarized and dated 2 years before his death," Cordelia said, producing the document herself. "I understand you didn't know about it. That doesn't make it any less valid, Grady. Everett had every right to protect his own interest in this business without your prior approval." "Why would he go behind my back on something like this?" Grady asked, and for a moment something almost hurt flickered across his composed expression, as though the betrayal of being kept in the dark stung him more than the legal consequences themselves. "Perhaps he'd already begun to suspect how you'd behave once he was gone," Cordelia said. "I don't say that to be cruel, Grady. I say it because you arrived at my door 4 days after the funeral with a buyout offer, before I'd even finished thanking people for their flowers. I think Everett may have understood you better than either of us wanted to admit while he was still alive to see it proven." Grady studied the amendment a long moment, his expression shifting from indignation to something considerably more calculating. "Even if this is valid," he said, "you'd still be taking on half ownership of an operation you have no experience actually running. I don't think that's a realistic choice for a widow with no background in grain trading." "I've kept this operation's books for 15 years, Cordelia said. "I understand this business considerably better than you seem to be giving me credit for, Grady. I intend to exercise the choice Everett left me, and I intend to remain a full and active partner in this business going forward, whatever assumptions you've made about what a widow is or isn't capable of managing. This changes everything about how this operation runs," Grady said. "I built half of this business's actual trading relationships myself. You'd be relying on me considerably more than you seem to appreciate if you actually intend to stay involved. Then I'd suggest we discuss how a genuine partnership might actually work going forward," Cordelia said, "rather than you continuing to assume I'll simply take whatever sum lets you avoid that conversation entirely." Cordelia's attorney confirmed the amendment's validity within the week, and Grady, faced with a legally sound document he had no grounds to contest, ultimately accepted Cordelia's decision to remain as an active partner rather than accept a buyout, though the working relationship between them remained, for the following months, considerably more formal and cautious than the friendship Everett and Grady had once shared. Louisa Pratt helped the two of them draft a revised operating agreement over the following weeks, one that clarified decision-making authority and profit distribution in language considerably more precise than the original document either partner had signed decades earlier as young men who trusted each other more than any contract required them to. "A good partnership agreement isn't about distrust," Louisa told them both during their final signing session. "It's about making certain trust doesn't have to carry weight it was never actually built to hold, particularly once one partner's no longer here to smooth over whatever the paperwork left unclear." The new agreement specified, in language both Cordelia and Grady reviewed carefully before signing, exactly how future disputes would be resolved, exactly what documentation each partner owed the other regarding significant business decisions, and exactly what would happen to each partner's share in the event of death, disability, or desired exit from the partnership. Terms considerably more thorough than anything the original decades-old document had ever attempted to address. Cordelia insisted, over Grady's initial objection, on a clause requiring any future amendments to be disclosed to both partners immediately upon execution, a provision she described plainly as ensuring No one ever again had to discover something this important tucked behind a drawer's false bottom, months after it might have mattered most. "Fair enough," Grady said, signing that particular clause without further argument. "I don't suppose either of us wants to repeat this particular education." Adelaide stayed on at the silo through that first difficult season, helping Cordelia manage the operation's physical maintenance, while Cordelia herself took on, gradually and with growing confidence, the business decisions Everett had once handled alone, the two women building an unlikely partnership of their own alongside the more complicated one Cordelia now shared with Grady. Cordelia formally hired Adelaide as the operations maintenance manager that winter, a position that gave Adelaide steady work for the first time since her own layoff, and the two of them settled into a rhythm that felt, to Adelaide, considerably more like family than employment, Cordelia teaching her the business side of grain trading in the evenings, while Adelaide taught Cordelia, in turn, the mechanical details of exactly how the operation's aging equipment actually worked. Cordelia grew visibly more confident over that first year, Adelaide noticed, the tired, uncertain woman she'd first found alone on the silo platform giving way, gradually, to someone who spoke in trade meetings with an authority Grady had once assumed she'd never develop. She negotiated her first independent grain contract that spring, a modest deal but one she'd structured and closed entirely on her own, and told Adelaide afterward, with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with the contract's actual value, that it was the first decision in this business she'd made without once wondering what Everett would have done in her place. She began attending the regional grain co-op meetings herself that following season, the same kind of gathering where Everett and Grady had first met as young men decades earlier, and found, to her own surprise, that the other operators treated her with a respect she hadn't fully expected, several of them mentioning, unprompted, that they'd watched her steer the Marsh operation through its hardest year, with a steadiness that spoke for itself regardless of anyone's earlier doubts about her capability. "I think I finally understand this operation as my own," Cordelia said, "rather than simply his that I happened to be managing in his absence." "Everett would have been glad you found that letter before it was too late to matter," Cordelia told Adelaide one evening that winter, watching the silo's restored aeration fan cycle steadily against a cold, clear sky. "I don't think I'd have thought to look behind that drawer myself, grief being what it was those first weeks. I think he wrote it exactly so somebody eventually would," Adelaide said. "Some men plan for the worry they can't fully protect against, and trust the right person to find the answer when it's actually needed." Grady's own relationship with the operation settled, over that first year, into something considerably more businesslike than the fractured suspicion of those early weeks. The two partners eventually finding a working rhythm that, while never quite recapturing the friendship Everett and Grady had once shared, at least allowed the operation itself to run smoothly for the benefit of everyone still depending on it. Grady stopped by less often than he once had, deferring increasingly to Cordelia's own judgment on decisions he'd have once insisted on making unilaterally. A small but steady acknowledgement, Cordelia thought, that the widow he'd once assumed incapable had proven him wrong on every count that mattered. Adelaide wrote to her own father that same winter, describing the silo and the aeration system and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine ladder inspection to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady work and unexpected family she'd feared she might never find again after the merger ended her own position. His reply came a few weeks later, brief but warm in the particular way she remembered him always being. "Told you a good silo inspector's habit of checking every ladder she passes would eventually lead somewhere worth staying. Proud of you for finding both the work and the person who needed you to find it," she thought, some evenings that first winter, about the 9 months of towns and merger notices that had led her to a silo platform on a cool autumn evening, and understood, watching Cordelia move through the operations building with a confidence that had barely existed the day they'd met, that she had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose her own father had spent a career quietly modeling for her. Not simply steady work, but work that mattered to somebody, specific, in a way no traveling maintenance crew serving 4 counties could ever quite replicate. Cordelia held a small gathering at the operations building that spring, marking the first full year since Everett's death, inviting a handful of neighboring farmers who depended on the silo's storage and had watched, over that difficult year, the operation not merely survive, but genuinely thrive under Cordelia's own growing leadership. Louisa Pratt attended as well, mentioning to Adelaide over coffee that she'd rarely seen a client transform so completely from the uncertain widow she'd first met to the confident businesswoman now hosting a room full of neighbors with evident ease. "Everett built something worth protecting," Louisa said, "and it seems his widow's built something worth admiring in her own right on top of it." Grady attended the gathering as well, standing somewhat apart from the rest of the small crowd, and approached Cordelia near the evening's end with an expression considerably more subdued than any he'd carried during their earlier confrontations. "Everett would be proud of what you've done with this place," he said. "I don't know that I've said that plainly before now." "Thank you, Grady," Cordelia said. "I think he'd be glad, too, that we found a way to keep working together, however differently than the two of you once did." "I owe you an apology I haven't properly given yet," Grady said. "For the 4 days after the funeral, and for assuming, before I'd bothered to actually ask, that grief had made you someone I could simply negotiate past, rather than someone I needed to negotiate with honestly." "I appreciate you saying so," Cordelia said. "I think Everett would have appreciated it too." Adelaide watched the small gathering from the silo's own platform later that evening, the same spot where she'd first startled a grieving widow into an unlikely friendship nearly a year earlier. Understanding, watching the warm lights of the operations building glow against the darkening farmland, exactly how far both of them had traveled since that first startled meeting. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many careful protections get written quietly and never mentioned, out of a fear of causing worry before it's actually necessary, only to matter more than anything else the moment grief finally tests them? And what does it take? A drifter, checking a silo's condition out of habit, a hidden letter behind a drawer, a widow's own quiet courage to claim what was always rightfully hers, for that careful protection to finally be found in time. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.